The first one I went to was I was still in field training, so we hadn't been out of the academy that long, and went to a guy that committed suicide by laying over some train tracks. So the train cut him completely in half, and there were pieces of him scattered everywhere. And I remember being probably not as shocked as I imagined I may have been, but it just kind of fascinated really by the gore of it. I don't know that I had like an intense emotional reaction to it. I think for myself personally, more than being affected by an individual incident, what I wasn't prepared for is just kind of the gradual buildup of that. So when you see one scene like that, and then another, and another, and another, I think that's the thing that kind of creeps up on you. But the actual individual incidents of trauma or gore or whatever, I don't think I had a real strong reaction to it in the beginning. I don't know what you guys saw.
Well, I mean, I think my first incident that I came across, I was just out of field training. I had it pretty easy. I field trained during the winter, so we didn't have a whole lot going on as far as that went. But I was about 6 months on my own and had a 16-year-old boy stabbed in the neck at a family party. I think that was the first one that I really kind of got tossed into it, where it involved a lot of people, a lot of chaos, and being so new in it. It's almost like you check out of it. That's the easiest way for me to describe it, is that you just kind of separate yourself away from it and kind of dial in to do what you have to do. But I mean, rendering aid, scene control, things like that, I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot of preparing that we ever do for it. It's more of a kind of a mental push-in. I see it. It's kind of a sink or swim, especially most guys see it early on in their career, and they can kind of figure out whether they can do this or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that was kind of my first incident. I mean, since then, kind of like what you said, Ryan, it just kind of escalates from there, and you just run with it.
I think that's the thing, is you almost, the guys who are going to be good at it almost have that innate instinct to create a professional distance between themselves psychologically and what they're seeing. But then that carries risks, because if you learn to distance yourself from everything that can be traumatic or trying, that can carry over into your personal life, and even from the way you treat victims. Mm-hmm. If you rely so much on that buffer zone, that psychological or emotional buffer zone, whatever, for everything you deal with, it can affect you as a human being. I think it makes you, you're not as good of a cop.
No. Because
you're so conditioned to protect yourself that you're not really processing everything going on in a scene, as a human being. What about you? What was the first thing you saw? Remember?
I don't know if I can think of like one thing that stood out to me. I mean, it's kind of like you said, it's kind of a culmination type of situation. I do remember one time, I hadn't been out of FTO very long, I don't think, but got called for a 13-year-old boy who hung himself, or had just hung himself. It was about 10 minutes after he had hung himself. So we get there, or I get there, and we get him pulled down and start doing CPR on him. And a couple minutes later, medics show up, and I remember, doing CPR on him for probably a good 15-20 minutes as they were trying to get him restarted, and my hands were slipping on his chest because it was a hot July day, and I was sweaty from doing CPR, but very traumatic, a lot going on. Mom in the background screaming and yelling. There were some siblings there, stuff like that. Eventually, we got him to the hospital, and but I guess the weird thing for me was, after all of that, once it was all done, I punched off that call and went back to answering like stupid calls. Somebody complaining because their their dog came over and did business in somebody's yard, and I go straight from a 13-year-old hanging himself to a neighbor saying, "Hey, my neighbor's dog came over and crapped in my yard." And just the variety of calls that you go on, and the different levels of trauma, really. And I don't know, it's kind of one of those things where it's you do what you got to do, because any of us, I think, if we want to be good cops, like you were saying, you kind of numb yourself a little bit. You just kind of, you do it because I want to do everything I need to do for this person. I want to do my job well. I want to be a good cop. So you kind of just focus on what it means to be a good cop in that situation. And like for me, I wasn't really thinking about what was going on during it. It was more of a, later on you start thinking about it and saying, well, could I have done this differently, things of that nature. But obviously that was different than anything I'd ever encountered before, especially before becoming a cop. So kind of a good or I don't know if it's a good, but kind of a culture shock to some extent for someone from my background.
I think that's the question we're talking about, is how prepared are you as a human being from wherever you're coming from. If you're coming from the military, if you're coming from college, if you're coming from another occupation, how prepared for you to do exactly what you just said. You got to deal with this high intensity situation. You got to deal with it professionally,
Right.
thoroughly, completely,
Right.
and then turn around, go 10-8, and go answer another call.
Yep.
Like, were we ever trained to do that? Were we ever prepared? And even after the fact, how about after the fact? Did somebody, hey, how you doing?
Well, that was another thing, because I remember, because I try to do that personally. Is after some of my guys go on or my buddies go on a call, I try to meet with them and say, hey, let's talk through this a little bit.
Yep.
And I remember after that one, I never met with anybody. I mean, that was came home and talked to my wife about it a little bit, and that was that. But as far as like preparation for stuff like that, nothing in the academy,
Yeah.
And really nothing as far as departmentally. It's just kind of something like you said. You kind of, you're in it, so you do it, and you don't really have a choice. You're in it and you do it.
And I think that's the risk for new cops is we're never taught to anticipate that moment. So you're going from this intense, traumatic situation. In your case, a 13-year-old who's killing himself, and the family's there in your middle of that, and then 15 minutes later, you're dealing with these normal garden variety calls.
Yep.
And nobody gives you a sense of what you ought to expect psychologically or emotionally, to prepare for that, to compensate for it. And so some guys who just are wired that way, naturally, they find a way to adapt. They find a way to adjust to that.
You kind of have to, because if you don't, then you're not going to be able to do your job.
Right.
And that's where you see people falling out and quitting after a year or two.
Yeah, and we talk about, these new folks that are getting in and how we've adjusted to it after time has gone on. We can talk about it all day long, but until you're really thrown into it, you never really know how you're going to react and what type of person you really are in this
100%.
situation. So,
Yep.
I mean, you talked about it, you get in the car and you go to the next call after somebody just tried to kill themselves. I know we were on the call together when the guy shot himself on the northwest side of town, and after that, we passed a couple cameramen who were sobbing because they just witnessed what we had witnessed, and then 10 minutes later, we're going to a loud party call. Being able to kind of desensitize to the fact that people are going to do terrible things to one another, and they're going to do terrible things to themselves, and there's somebody eventually that we're going to come across that's going to be a need later on in that night. So going from something that's violent, that we need to act in a fast and potentially violent manner with that incident, and then dialing it back down to helping a kid in a car accident or something like that. It's how do you really prepare for it mentally?
It's a tall order.
It really
You're
is.
asking a lot of somebody.
Yeah, it's incredible. I don't think people really realize it. Going through the academy, and going through training and talking to people, it's like words don't describe what it actually does emotionally to everybody.
Yeah.
I came from a background where I had never dealt with the police ever. I've been pulled over a couple times, but other than that, I never dealt with the police. And really, I kind of went into police work. I mean, it wasn't something I ever planned to do, but kind of went into it thinking that the job of the policeman was to pull people over who were driving too fast. That's the only time I encountered them. You know what I'm saying? And then once you actually get out there and get out in the street, it's a whole different atmosphere where there's a lot that, like you said, we're not prepared for. They don't teach you in the academy about some of the things you'll feel with after a scene, or having to make that transition from a very tragic scene to either a violent scene or just a scene that's just very trivial. They don't teach you about the transitions and about how you're going to relate to some of those scenarios.
And that's the biggest gap in our training, I think, is we talk about how to use the car, how to use a variety of firearms, less lethal tools, all that stuff. We talk about all the implements that we're going to use, but we don't talk about the impact that we're likely to have from what we do. You know what I mean? We don't talk about what your reaction could be, what it should be, what a healthy reaction looks like.
Yeah.
And then if you have an unhealthy reaction, how do we address that? There's no apparatus, nothing in place. And I think nobody in our profession really wants to talk about that, which is strange because we talk about a lot of dangerous and ugly things, but all they want to say is employee assistance.
Right.
Yeah.
But we need to start preparing people for those sorts of things, you know what I mean? So that if they do have an unfavorable, unhealthy almost unprofessional reaction. We have a means in place to address that.
That's a good point. That they teach us how to use the tools. Or they teach us all about the tools, but not about the person who's using the tools.
The brain, the mentality of the person.
The brain behind the
How you
tools.
should, I don't even know if, and I guess it's just speaking from where we work, but what kind of visibility does law enforcement really have on that? I mean, I came from a military background where I have some experience in crisis leadership, and the gore and the ugliness of humanity I was kind of exposed to before I got on. But what I noticed right away it wasn't the first call I went on, but one of the first ones where I saw like people in high stress situations when that 3-year-old kid baked at Corby Homes in the car, and we're trying to do CPR on them, and there was a couple veteran officers there that couldn't even respond because they were so torn up by it. They had their own kids, and I'm like, wow, this could be a problem. For me, and just thinking back to the military days, that's a problem. We need to get honest and get candid with this guy and find out what's going on. But to my knowledge, I don't think anything like that happened. They just let him sit in his car.
That's like a culmination of things. I think sooner or later your glass gets too full with it, and the stigma that's around what we do and how we deal with it. I mean, I don't necessarily want to say things are hidden from the general public, but if the general public really knew what we did, what we encountered on an 8-hour shift, I think most people would be blown away. Just what we do and how we trigger, how we act to things, and the incidents that we see, and on a Tuesday night, or even afternoons gets a lot of the call volume that we get on nights. But I mean, some of the violence, people I just think they're completely mute to the point that it's actually going on.
It's interesting to say that. We had a murder a couple weeks ago, and the guy was shot through the head, catastrophic, so he was dead. I mean, there was nothing we could do for him, and so we left his body in place for a brief time because of evidence, scene preservation, that kind of thing. And the cameraman walked up. We were outside the tape and everything, and one of the guys from the local news agencies came up and said, so what happened here? We heard there were shots fired and that kind of thing. And I said, yeah, there was a man murdered. I said, if you look behind you, you'll see him right over there. And so he looks, and his reaction, he was aghast, It's like, oh my God, there's a dead person over there, and we're all just walking around doing our work, the things we have to do. But it was kind of a reminder of the point you were making, which is the things that have become kind of normal to us, which have to have an impact, I suppose, at some level. For normal people, when they see him, it can be devastating. It's a really traumatic thing. And so again, that goes to how well you prepared to react as a professional, to perform as a professional, but at the same time still be a human being in your personal life, in the rest of your professional life.
I think that's the biggest risk you run when if you, and I think everybody goes through it, maybe after year 3 or 4, where you can be completely closed off to the emotion of that. You can literally go to a scene like that with people at their very worst, blood everywhere, and you can be completely immune to it. You can turn it off. And I think there's a risk in doing that too much, because then, like you said, what about the other side of the coin? What about the call you have to go on next with this 82-year-old woman who's worried about some guy that's in her backyard that's not in her backyard?
Right.
You have to completely change gears. But if you've always got that front up, there's a huge part of what we do that's going to suffer.
Well, when you go to a DOA or something like that, and what the family needs from the police is a little bit of understanding, a little bit of patience. But if you're a newer guy, or even if you're a veteran and you haven't figured out a way to acclimate yourself to going back and forth between that world of professional distance and the world of performance, then you can come off being a complete asshole to these people when you should be more of a thoughtful human being.
And you would be in any other situation.
Right.
You know what I mean?